throwaway account because some of my relatives are on Reddit, and I'm not here to relive this in real life again. I came back home after my service, thinking the hard part was already behind me. Turns out, the war wasn't the most humiliating thing I've lived through. Home was. For context, I left my family years ago. No dramatic fight, no screaming. I packed a small bag, closed the door quietly, and disappeared. Everyone assumed I'd run off with some useless guy. That's what he told them, at least. My father liked that version. It fit his narrative nicely. He used to say I was weak, too sensitive, that I'd never survive on my own. Before I left, his tone changed. Shorter sentences, colder looks, jokes at my expense in front of relatives, comments like, "She'll come crawling back." Sometimes humiliation wasn't even verbal. Silence can be worse. I didn't correct anyone when they guessed why I left. I didn't defend myself. I just vanished. What none of them knew, what he never bothered to imagine, was that I didn't run away to be saved by someone else. I ran towards something that didn't care about my past, my fear, or his opinion. I joined the army, in secret. No goodbye posts, no calls home. I learned early that explaining yourself to people who enjoy belittling you is pointless. While he was telling relatives I'd thrown my life away, I was learning how to stand still under pressure, how to follow orders, how to survive without asking permission. Back then, before I left, the humiliation was subtle but constant. Being talked over, being told I was nothing without him, being reminded daily that I had a place and it wasn't at the table. I remember thinking as I closed the door behind me, if I ever come back, it won't be as the person he thinks I am. At the time, I didn't know if I'd ever return. He was sure I would. Broken, ashamed, easy to control again. He was very wrong. Before I left, the humiliation didn't start all at once. That's the part people who've never lived. It don't understand. It wasn't a single slap of cruelty. It was erosion. It began with jokes, small ones. "You're too soft. You wouldn't last a week on your own. Who would ever take you seriously?" They were always said with a half smile, usually in front of someone else. Family dinners, friends visiting, the kind of comments you're expected to laugh off so you don't look dramatic. If I didn't laugh, he'd sigh and say I was proving his point. Then it shifted. He stopped using my name when he was angry. Just you. He stopped asking questions and started giving verdicts. I'd enter a room and feel the temperature drop. I remember one specific evening clearly. I had made dinner. Nothing fancy, just something warm. He took one bite, pushed the plate away, and said, "If you can't even get this right, what good are you?" My mother stared at her hands. No one said a word. That silence did more damage than the words. After that, it escalated. My clothes were suddenly inappropriate. My posture was wrong. My opinions were disrespectful. If I spoke too much, I was annoying. If I stayed quiet, I was sulking. The worst part? The unpredictability. One day he'd be calm, almost pleasant. The next, he'd explode over nothing. A misplaced cup, a late reply, a look he decided meant something it didn't. I learned to measure my steps, my tone, even my breathing. Humiliation became routine. He liked reminding me that the house was his, that food wasn't free, that I should be grateful. Sometimes his hand would land on the table inches from mine, hard enough to make the dishes jump. Sometimes it didn't stop at the table. Afterward, he'd act like nothing happened. That's when I understood something was deeply wrong, not with me, but with the idea that staying was survival. Staying was slow destruction. The final discovery came quietly. One morning, I overheard him talking to a relative on the phone. He was laughing. "She won't go anywhere," he said. "Where would she go? She needs me." Something inside me went cold and very clear. I realized he didn't see me as a daughter. He saw me as a possession that hadn't learned its place yet. someone to correct, to break down and rebuild smaller. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't confront him. I didn't pack everything, only what I could carry without being noticed. Documents, a change of clothes, shoes that wouldn't slow me down. When I closed the door behind me, my hands were shaking, but my mind was calm for the first time in years. He thought I ran away. He told himself that story because it made him feel powerful. What he didn't know, what I didn't tell anyone, was that the humiliation didn't chase me out. It trained me. It taught me how to endure discomfort, how to stay quiet under pressure, how to disappear without making noise. Those lessons followed me straight into uniform. And once I was gone, I never looked back. Not because I was afraid, but because I finally understood something essential. I was never weak. I was just trapped in a place that needed me to believe I was. The confrontation didn't happen the way people imagine confrontations. There was no shouting match, no dramatic moment where I suddenly stood up for myself, and everything changed. That's a lie movies tell. In real life, the first confrontation happened quietly, and it happened inside me long before it ever happened with him. It was the night after I overheard that phone call, the one where he laughed and said I'd never go anywhere without him. I sat on my bed in the dark, listening to the house breathe. Every sound felt louder than it should have. The hum of the fridge, the ticking clock, his footsteps pacing like he owned time itself. At some point, he opened my door without knocking. He never knocked. "You're awfully quiet," he said. "That usually means you're sulking." I didn't answer. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, looking at me like a problem he hadn't solved yet. "You think you're better than us now," he continued, walking around with that look on your face. "Don't forget where you belong." There it was again. Belong. Something shifted in me. Not anger, not fear. Distance. "I'm tired," I said calmly. That made him scoff. "You're tired? Of what? You don't do anything." The words should have hurt. Normally, they would have. But that night, they landed differently. Like hearing rain hit a roof from inside a solid house. Loud, but unable to reach me. He stepped closer. Too close. "You need to stop acting like a victim," he said. "You should be grateful I put up with you." I remember looking at his face and noticing how predictable it all was. The script, the timing, the need to assert control when he sensed it slipping. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't apologize. "I didn't ask you to put up with me," I said. The room went very still. That was the first time I saw real surprise flicker across his face. Not rage, confusion, as if I'd said something in a language he didn't understand. "Watch your tone," he snapped. "You're getting ideas above your station." Station. I nodded once, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, like I was mentally checking something off a list. "Good night," I said. I turned off the lamp. He stood there for a few seconds, clearly expecting me to backtrack, to beg, to explain myself. When I didn't, he left the room hard enough to rattle the walls. The next morning, he pretended nothing happened. That was his specialty. But his behavior changed. Sharper remarks, more scrutiny. He watched me like someone guarding a door they're afraid will open. The real confrontation came days later, when he realized I wasn't reacting anymore. He criticized my clothes. I said nothing. He mocked my silence. I stayed quiet. He raised his voice. I stayed level. That unnerved him. One evening at dinner, in front of relatives, he laughed and said, "She's been acting strange lately, probably planning another stupid mistake." I looked up and met his eyes. "No," I said evenly. "I'm planning something smart." Laughter died mid-breath. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, voice tightening. "It means," I replied, still calm, "that not everything you don't understand is a mistake." His face flushed. He leaned forward, lowering his voice in warning. "Don't test me." And there it was. The final card he always played. For the first time, I didn't flinch. "I'm not testing you," I said. "I'm done being measured by you." Silence crashed down around the table. My hands were steady. My heart was racing, but it felt clean, like fear leaving instead of entering. That night, I packed. He thought I was bluffing, thought I'd wake up scared and apologize like always. Instead, I left before dawn. No note, no explanation, no confrontation he could twist into his version of events. Years later, when I stood in front of him again, calm, straight-backed, wearing a uniform he never imagined me earning, I remembered that dinner table. And I realized something important. That was the moment I stopped being his victim. It just took him years to find out. People like to think strength arrives all at once, like you wake up one morning fearless, healed, untouchable. That's not how it happened for me. Strength came in fragments, and so did the pain. After I left, the first emotion wasn't relief. It was shock. Real, physical shock. My body didn't know what to do without constant tension. I slept in short bursts, waking up convinced I'd heard his footsteps. Every loud sound made my muscles lock. Every authority figure made my stomach tighten. I was free, but my nervous system didn't believe it yet. Then came anger. Not the explosive kind, something colder. It hit me during small moments, standing in line somewhere and realizing no one was watching my posture, eating without bracing for criticism, choosing silence because I wanted to, not because I was afraid. I'd think, he stole this from me. Years of peace, of softness, of not doubting every word before speaking. That anger burned quietly and constantly. When I enlisted, I thought the discipline would erase the past. In some ways, it did. The structure helped. Orders were clear. Rules were consistent. Punishment was fair and predictable. Nothing like home. If you failed because of your actions, not because someone needed to feel powerful. But trauma doesn't disappear just because you put on a uniform. There were nights during training when exhaustion stripped everything bare. No energy left to suppress memories. I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying moments I'd buried. His voice. The way the room felt smaller when he entered. The humiliation that wasn't loud but constant, like pressure underwater. I hated that those memories followed me into a place where I was becoming strong. That contradiction messed with my head. I felt guilty for being angry. Guilty for missing my mother. Guilty for not missing him. Guilt was a habit I'd learned well. Even when no one was accusing me, I accused myself. Then came fear. Not fear of him, but fear that he'd been right. Fear that without opposition, I wouldn't know who I was. That maybe I only functioned under pressure. That maybe I needed someone to push against. Combat zones stripped that illusion away. Fear there was simple, clean. You reacted or you didn't. No psychological games. No humiliation disguised as love. Either you trusted your training or you didn't survive. And something unexpected happened. Fear burned out of me. Not all fear, just the kind tied to his approval, his moods, his judgment. In its place came clarity. I learned my limits, and they were farther than I'd ever been allowed to imagine. I learned that pain didn't automatically mean failure, that silence could be powerful, that I could endure without shrinking. Acceptance didn't come as forgiveness. That's important. Acceptance meant understanding that what happened to me shaped me, but it didn't own me. I stopped replaying imaginary confrontations, stopped rehearsing things I'd say if I ever saw him again. The past lost its grip when I stopped needing closure from the person who caused the wound. By the time I decided to come home for Christmas years later, I wasn't angry anymore. I was calm. And that scared me more than rage ever could have. Because calm meant I no longer needed him to change for me to be whole. Calm meant the power dynamic he built his identity around no longer existed. I didn't come back seeking revenge. I didn't come back seeking validation. I came back because I wanted to sit at the table as myself and see what would happen. What I didn't expect was how quickly everything would unravel for him once I did. But that part came later. At that point, emotionally, I had already crossed the most important line. I no longer carried his voice inside my head. And once that voice was gone, there was space for something else. My own. The decision to come back wasn't dramatic either. No sudden realization, no cinematic moment where I stared out a window and whispered, "It's time." It was quieter than that. Almost boring. I was sitting on my bunk, cleaning my gear, when someone mentioned Christmas leave. Just a casual comment. Plans, flights, families. I froze for half a second. Home hadn't existed as a real place in my mind for years. It was more like an old scar, something you're aware of but don't touch. But that night, instead of the usual tightening in my chest, I felt nothing. That scared me. So I asked myself the question I'd been avoiding. If I went back now, what could he actually do to me? The answer was unsettlingly simple. Nothing. He couldn't ground me. He couldn't threaten my survival. He couldn't define me. The power he once had depended entirely on who I used to be. So I requested leave. Not to confront him. Not to prove anything. Just to exist in the same space and see whether the old fear still worked. I needed to know if I'd really changed, or if I was just stronger as long as he wasn't around. The day I traveled back, my hands were steady, my heart rate normal. That alone felt like a victory. When I arrived, I didn't announce myself. No warning calls, no messages. I walked into that house like a stranger who owed no explanations. The walls looked smaller than I remembered, the air thinner. Even the silence felt different. Less oppressive, more hollow. He was exactly the same. Same posture, same tone, same assumption of authority. The moment he spoke, I saw it clearly. He hadn't evolved at all. His identity was frozen in a version of himself that only worked when others were smaller. When he said there was no place for me at the table, it wasn't about space. It was about hierarchy, about reminding everyone, including himself, who was supposed to matter. And in that moment, I made another decision. I wouldn't leave, not dramatically, not in tears, not with an argument he could retell as proof of his righteousness. I would stay, calmly, publicly, without asking permission. Taking off my jacket wasn't planned. I hadn't rehearsed it. It was instinct, like stepping into formation, like muscle memory. The uniform spoke before I ever could. The medals weren't about pride. They were evidence, proof of time spent in places where his voice would have meant nothing. Proof that the version of me he invented had no authority anymore. When I sat in his chair, I wasn't claiming power. I was demonstrating reality. After that night, things shifted fast. Relatives who had once avoided my eyes suddenly asked questions. Carefully, respectfully. My mother started sleeping better, standing straighter. He, on the other hand, unraveled. Small things set him off. He complained about disrespect, about being pushed out, about how no one appreciated him anymore. For the first time, I watched him without emotional involvement. And I understood. Revenge wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be cruel. It wouldn't require action at all. My existence was enough. So my resolution wasn't to destroy him, or forgive him, or even confront him again. It was simpler. I left that house on my own terms, not running, not escaping, walking out the front door in uniform, head high, knowing I'd already won something far more valuable than his fear. I chose myself. And once that choice was made, nothing he said or did afterward mattered anymore. The aftermath didn't explode. It leaked. That's the part people don't warn you about. What happens after the moment everyone gasps, after the silence lands, after you finally do the thing you thought would change everything? Life doesn't reset. It rearranges. The morning after Christmas, I woke up early out of habit. The house was quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar, not tense, just empty. I made coffee without asking. No one commented. That alone told me more than any argument could have. He didn't speak to me, not because he was calm, because he didn't know how. For years, every interaction with me had been built on control. Once that was gone, there was nothing left to say. No script, no leverage, no role that fit him anymore. I noticed small things. He avoided rooms I was in. He watched conversations instead of leading them. He corrected himself mid-sentence, like someone suddenly aware they might be challenged. That awareness terrified him. Relatives treated me differently too. Some awkward, some overly polite. A few tried to rewrite the past. He was always strict, but he meant well. I didn't engage. I wasn't there to correct the narrative. I didn't need to. What surprised me most was my own reaction. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel hollow. I felt neutral. That neutrality was new. The old version of me would have been hyper-alert, waiting for the next insult, the next eruption. This version simply observed. I saw him the way you see a storm from far away, aware it exists, but no longer standing in the rain. One evening, he finally spoke. Not an apology. Of course not. You think you're better than me now, he said quietly, almost bitterly. I looked at him, really looked. The lines on his face, the stiffness in his shoulders, the fear hiding under arrogance. No, I said. I don't think about you like that at all. That hurt him more than anger ever could have. He scoffed, muttered something about arrogance, about uniforms going to people's heads, old defenses, weak ones. I didn't respond. Because here's the truth I hadn't admitted to myself yet. I wasn't healing for him. I wasn't moving on because of him. I was just done. The humiliation that once defined my reactions didn't work anymore. His attempts to provoke slid off me like static. Without an audience, without fear, his power dissolved into something small and sad. I left a few days later. No goodbye speech, no final confrontation. I hugged my mother, nodded at relatives, picked up my bag. As I reached the door, I felt something unexpected. Not closure, but confirmation. I didn't need distance to survive anymore. I chose it because I wanted peace. Walking away that time felt different than the first. The first escape was fueled by desperation. This one was deliberate, measured, clean. Outside, the air felt sharp and real. My phone buzzed with messages from my unit, from people who knew exactly who I was, without needing to diminish me first. As I walked down the steps, I realized something that made me stop for a moment. The humiliation hadn't ended when I left home. It ended when it stopped shaping my decisions. And that was something no one could ever take from me again. I thought the story ended when I left again. That the silence afterward meant closure. I underestimated how deeply some people rely on humiliation to feel whole. The attempts didn't come immediately. They waited, like predators testing whether the fence is real. It started with messages, not directly from him at first, never directly when there's plausible deniability to hide behind. It came through relatives, casual comments passed along as concern. He's worried you've changed too much. He says the army made you cold. He thinks you're angry and don't even realize it. I almost laughed at that last one. Anger had been the fuel once. Now, it wasn't even a background noise. But I recognized the tactic instantly. Reframe my calm as damage. Turn my boundaries into pathology. If he could convince others, and maybe himself, that I was broken, then the hierarchy could still be restored. It didn't work. So he escalated. A cousin forwarded me a post he'd made online. Vague, no names, just enough implication. Funny how uniforms give people confidence they never earned, he wrote. Some people mistake obedience for strength. I stared at the screen longer than I expected to. Not because it hurt, but because it was desperate. This was a man who once didn't need an audience to humiliate me. Now he needed strangers. That realization landed heavier than anything he'd said before. A week later, I ran into him by accident. Small town. I was picking up documents. He didn't expect to see me alone without family buffering the interaction. His eyes flicked to my posture first. Still straight. Still steady. "Well," he said loudly, glancing around. "Look who's back playing soldier." There it was. The attempt. I felt the old instinct flicker, the urge to explain, to justify, to defend the reality of what I'd done and seen. Instead, I felt something else. Annoyance, like stepping in mud with clean boots. "Hello," I said politely. That threw him. "You don't salute civilians," he scoffed. "Or did they forget to teach you that?" People nearby slowed, listening. He was counting on that. I took a breath. Slow. Measured. The way you do before making a decision that can't be undone. "You're right," I said calmly. "They taught me a lot more useful things." "Like what?" He pushed, voice rising. "Following orders? Learning how not to think?" I met his eyes. Held them. "Like recognizing when someone is trying to humiliate me," I said, "and choosing not to participate." The silence was immediate and absolute. A woman behind the counter cleared her throat. Someone pretended to check their phone. The moment he'd staged collapsed in on itself. His face tightened. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You think this makes you untouchable?" "No," I replied. "I think it makes me uninterested." That was the worst possible outcome for him. Humiliation requires engagement, resistance, emotion. Without that, it starves. He tried one last thing. "You'll regret turning your back on family," he said. "One day, you'll need us." I smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, just honestly. "I already needed myself," I said, "and I showed up." I walked away before he could respond. My hands weren't shaking, my heart wasn't racing. The encounter didn't follow me home. That was how I knew the dynamic had truly broken. Later that night, I realized something unsettling but freeing. All his attempts at humiliation were echoes, delayed reactions to a loss of control he still couldn't process. They weren't about me anymore. They were about him trying to convince himself that I hadn't escaped the role he built for me. And once I saw that clearly, every future attempt lost its teeth before it even began. Because you can't humiliate someone who no longer agrees to stand where you point. Something shifted after that encounter in town, but not loudly. It was subtle, almost bureaucratic, like a file being reclassified. People started to recognize me, not in the cinematic way. No applause, no speeches. Just small, unmistakable changes in how they interacted with me. A pause before speaking. A question instead of an assumption. Space where there used to be dismissal. It began with my mother. She called one evening, her voice hesitant in a way I hadn't heard before. Not fearful, careful. "I told your aunt to stop repeating things he says about you," she said. "I didn't argue. I just told her she didn't know you." That sentence stayed with me. She didn't defend me by rewriting the past. She defended me by refusing to let others define my present. Then it spread outward. An old family friend ran into me and said, "You seem different." Not accusatory. Curious. I answered honestly, "I am." And for once, that was enough. The most unsettling recognition came from people who had witnessed the humiliation years ago and said nothing. They didn't apologize. Most people don't. Instead, they adjusted their behavior like someone stepping around a scar they suddenly noticed. They asked about my work. They listened when I spoke. They stopped laughing at jokes made at my expense. Recognition doesn't erase the past, but it does something else. It validates your memory of it. It tells you that what you experienced was real, even if no one named it at the time. He noticed this too. Of course he did. Recognition is a threat to people who rely on invisibility to maintain control. He tried to reclaim it in quieter ways now. Less confrontation, more implication. Comments framed as concern, warnings disguised as wisdom. "She's changed," he'd say. "You never know what that kind of life does to someone." But the tone had shifted. He wasn't narrating anymore. He was reacting. The real moment of recognition came unexpectedly, during a small gathering. Nothing formal, just coffee, a few relatives, neutral territory. He was there, but not central, already a change. Someone asked me about leadership, about responsibility, about how decisions are made when there's no good option. I answered thoughtfully, careful not to dramatize. Just facts. Just experience. Halfway through my sentence, I realized everyone was listening. Even him. Not with disdain, with something closer to disbelief. For the first time, I saw it clearly in his eyes. He didn't recognize me, but he recognized authority. And that shook him. Because authority that doesn't come from fear is something he never learned to navigate. Afterward, he pulled me aside, not aggressively, not publicly, quietly. "You speak like you think you know better than everyone," he said. I studied his face, the tension, the effort it took to sound controlled. "I speak like someone who learned the cost of being wrong," I replied. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't expose him further. That night, lying in bed, I felt something unfamiliar and almost uncomfortable. Pride. Not the brittle kind that needs validation, the grounded kind that comes from alignment, when who you are matches how you act. I didn't need him to recognize me, but watching him realize that others already had, that was the moment I truly understood the shift. Humiliation isolates you. Recognition reconnects you, to yourself first, and then to the world. And once that connection is restored, the people who benefited from your silence don't know where to stand anymore. They're not angry because you changed. They're afraid because you're visible now. And visibility, once claimed, is very hard to take back. The turning point didn't arrive with shouting or ultimatums. It arrived disguised as normalcy, which made it more dangerous. By then, the dynamic had shifted enough that he stopped attacking openly. Instead, he started behaving as if nothing had ever happened, like the past could be overwritten simply by ignoring it. That was his last strategy. He invited me to sit down and talk. Not an apology, not accountability, a conversation. The kind that sounds reasonable to outsiders, the kind that lets him say later, "I tried." I almost declined. Almost. But something in me wanted to see it through. Not for closure, but for clarity. I wanted to know whether there was anything left to untangle, or if the knot had already been cut. We sat across from each other at the same table that had once been used to put me in my place. He started carefully. "You've done well for yourself," he said, like he was commenting on the weather. I suppose I didn't expect that. There it was, the backhanded acknowledgement. I said nothing. "You have to understand," he continued. "I was hard on you because I wanted you to be strong." I felt something stir, not anger, not pain, recognition. This wasn't an explanation. It was a rewrite. "I was already strong," I said quietly. "You just didn't like how that looked." His jaw tightened. "You always twist things," he snapped. Then, catching himself, softened his tone again. "I'm saying we should move on. Put it behind us. Families do that." Families. The word felt heavy, loaded, like bait. "Moving on doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen," I replied. He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "So what do you want? An apology? Is that it?" That question revealed everything. Because if this conversation were truly about reconciliation, he wouldn't have framed accountability as a demand. He would have offered it freely. "I don't want anything from you," I said. "That's the point." He laughed, sharp and humorless. "That's what you think." Everyone wants something. No, I said. Everyone used to want something from me. That's different. The silence stretched. I could see it then. The exact moment he realized he no longer had a role to play in my life. Not as a judge, not as a guide, not even as an adversary. And that terrified him. "You're acting like I'm the villain," he said. I met his gaze, steady, unmoved. "I'm acting like I don't need a villain anymore." That was it. The turning point wasn't me standing up or walking away. It was the moment I stopped explaining myself to someone who benefited from misunderstanding me. He stood abruptly, chair scraping the floor. "This is what they did to you," he said bitterly. "They turned you against your own family." I stood too, slower, calmer. "No," I said. "I finally learned the difference." He left the room without another word. Later that night, I sat alone and let myself feel it all. Not the pain, but the finality. The grief of accepting that the person who was supposed to protect me had never planned to. And strangely, that acceptance didn't break me. It grounded me. Because once you stop hoping someone will become who they aren't, you're free to become who you already are. That was the turning point. Not the uniform, not the medals, not the silence at the table. It was the moment I chose truth over reconciliation. And from that point on, nothing he said could touch me again. After the turning point, I expected something dramatic to happen. Some final act. One last attempt to pull me back into orbit. It didn't come. Instead, what followed was distance. Real distance, not the fragile silence from before. He stopped reaching out entirely. No comments passed through relatives, no concern, no warnings. It was as if, once he realized I wouldn't bend, he no longer knew how to exist in relation to me at all. And that was the resolution. Not reconciliation, not revenge, removal. I noticed how my body responded to that absence. I slept better, deeper. I stopped scanning rooms automatically. I laughed without checking who might hear it. I made plans without factoring in how they'd be received. The hypervigilance faded slowly, like a fever breaking. What surprised me most was that I didn't feel empty where he used to be. I'd been told my whole life that without him, I'd be lost. That I needed opposition to function. That I'd fall apart without pressure. Instead, I expanded. I invested more in my work, took on responsibility without shrinking myself to make it palatable. I built relationships that didn't require performance or endurance, just honesty. People who didn't mistake my calm for weakness or my silence for consent. One night, months later, I realized something quietly profound. I hadn't thought about him all day. Not once. That's when I knew the humiliation had truly lost its grip. Because humiliation doesn't just come from someone else. It lives on in repetition, in memory, in the way you preemptively limit yourself to avoid being cut down again. And I wasn't doing that anymore. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I didn't need him to acknowledge what he'd done. I didn't need the story to end cleanly or neatly. It ended functionally, with boundaries that didn't require enforcement, with distance that didn't need justification, with a life that didn't include him as a reference point. Resolution, I learned, isn't about winning. It's about no longer playing the game at all. I stopped asking myself what he would think. I stopped wondering what version of me he'd describe to others. I stopped reacting. And when you stop reacting, people who rely on reaction lose their power completely. That's how it resolved. Not loudly, not publicly, but permanently. I'm writing this part weeks after I thought the story was over, because distance gives you perspective you don't have while you're still inside the fog. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that experiences like this don't really end. They settle. Looking back, the humiliation wasn't just about being belittled. It was about being defined by someone who needed me smaller so they could feel larger. The service didn't magically erase that damage. What it did was give me contrast. It showed me environments where rules were clear, consequences were earned, and respect wasn't something you begged for. It was something you demonstrated through consistency. Strength, I learned, isn't loud. It's waking up without dread. It's choosing not to explain yourself. It's recognizing manipulation without needing to call it out. When I think about the girl who left home years ago with a small bag and no explanation, I don't feel pity. I feel respect. She didn't have the language yet, but she had instinct. She knew staying meant disappearing, and leaving, no matter how terrifying, meant a chance to exist. If you're reading this and you're still in that place, where humiliation is disguised as discipline, or concern, or family dynamics, here's the hardest truth I can offer. You don't need permission to leave. You don't need the perfect argument. You don't need them to understand. Understanding is not a prerequisite for freedom. People who benefit from your silence will always frame your growth as betrayal. They'll call you cold, ungrateful, changed. Let them. Change is the point. Staying the same is what keeps the cycle intact. Another thing no one tells you: you don't have to confront your abuser to heal. Closure doesn't require a final conversation. Sometimes closure is realizing that the person who hurt you is incapable of giving you what you need and choosing to stop asking. That's not weakness. That's clarity. I used to think survival meant endurance, taking hits, staying quiet, learning how not to provoke. Now I know survival can also mean walking away calmly, without drama, without turning back, and building a life so solid that the past can't reach you anymore. The moment at the Christmas table wasn't my victory. The real victory was everything that came after. When I didn't replay it in my head, didn't analyze it, didn't need it to mean more than it already did. It was just confirmation of a decision I'd made long ago. I'm not writing this to glorify pain or military service or confrontation. I'm writing it because humiliation thrives in isolation, and stories like this break that isolation. If you're being humiliated now, hear this clearly. You are not imagining it. You are not weak for being affected, and you are not obligated to stay where your dignity is negotiable. You don't have to become someone else to escape. You just have to choose yourself once, and keep choosing yourself every day after that. That's how it really ends. Not with revenge, not with forgiveness, but with a life that finally belongs to you.